All right, so the vertebra. So a typical vertebra here has its body, which is this weight-bearing portion of the vertebra. Vertebral arch, as you see, arching over, forming this passageway, which is the vertebral foramen, through which the spinal cord passes. Lamina are the sheets-like portions of bone here and here. There's two laminae. And then two pedicels here and here. The pedicels come off of the body. So one pedicel meets a lamina, meeting another lamina, meeting another pedicel, and they form the vertebral arch. Processes, bones that jut out. There's superior and inferior articular processes. This is a superior view from above. So this and this are the superior articulating processes, and the smooth portion are their facets, where they articulate with another bone. And this is the inferior view, so here's the inferior articular process with the facets that would articulate with the bone below, inferiorly. And then the spinous process juts out posteriorly out the back. So this is anterior, and that's posterior. Here's a view of the lamina, one lamina there, another lamina there. There's the spinous process. Pedicel here, pedicel here. There's the vertebral arch again, and the vertebral foramen, where the spinal cord moves through. Now, the vertebrae articulate with vertebra above and vertebrae below, and between them there's a gap. That's called the intervertebral foramen, the opening between the vertebra. And this is where the spinal nerves exit the spinal cord. So this white arrow is following the path of the spinal cord, and then the nerves have to exit out between the vertebral column, and they go out via these openings, intervertebral foramen. And then another view of the superior and inferior articular processes. There's the superior articular process, which will articulate with the vertebra above. And there's the inferior articular process. There's two of them, just like there's two superior, that articulates with the vertebra below. And in blue, that's indicating that's where the hyaline cartilage would be covering the facets on the articular processes. And then the spinous process juts out posteriorly. Processes. Okay. This is just a view here showing you a couple of vertebrae articulated, and there's a spinal nerve coming out of that opening, intervertebral foramen. So a lateral opening out of the vertebral, between the vertebral column to allow the spinal nerves to exit and leave the spinal cord. Cervical vertebrae, excuse me, they have openings on the transverse processes called transverse foramina, plural. So each cervical vertebrae has three openings, two transverse foramina and the vertebral foramen. C1, the most superior cervical vertebrae, is called the atlas, and it's modified. It has really no body and a really small or absent spinous process. Its superior articulating facets articulate with the occipital condyles of the occipital bone, here and here. And then C2, just inferior to C1, is called the axis, because it has this extra process called the dens, and that articulates with this little groove here, this facet on C1, allowing C1 to pivot around C2, allowing you to kind of move your head to left and right, like when you say no, no, no. And that's the dens or the odontoid process. And it forms a pivot joint with the axis, like so here. So again, the axis can pivot around, the atlas can pivot around the axis. C1 can pivot about C2, like so. Posterior view, both of these are posterior views. Here's the spinous process of C2. There's C1 pivoting around the dens of C2. You can see here the superior articulating processes and their facets on C1 atlas articulates with the occipital condyles there on the occipital bone. Okay, so moving down to the other cervical vertebrae. C3 through C6 have a bifid spinous process, two prong-like protrusions on that spinous process. And then C7 has a large spinous process that's referred to as the vertebra prominens. And that's very obvious when you drop your head forward, and you can feel that and you can see that obvious bump of C7's vertebra prominens. If you look at this X-ray, you can count the cervical vertebrae. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And notice that on this individual, that vertebra prominens is broken. There's a fracture there. Some sort of trauma happened to this individual. Okay, let's move on to the thoracic vertebrae, T1 through T12. They're bigger and stronger than the cervical vertebrae because they simply have to support more weight. In fact, they get larger as you go down the column. They are smaller than the lumbar vertebrae, which are even bigger yet. They have additional facets that articulate with the ribs, so these are called the costal facets. And I'll show you a picture of how they articulate with the ribs, like so. So here's the spinous process. So this is the back and the front, posterior, anterior. Flip it around. Here's the anterior part, and then there's the spinous process. So that would be the posterior back and anterior front. And each rib articulates with the costal facets on two vertebrae, articulating there, and that rib kind of arches back a little bit posteriorly, and part of it, excuse me, articulates with the costal facet here on the transverse process, and then that meanders forward to the sternum, like so. You see the head of the rib articulates with two vertebra and one transverse process at the costal facets, and then that rib comes forward, and depending on the rib has its independent costal cartilage, which articulates with the sternum, your breastbone. And moving down inferior to this would be the lumbar vertebrae. Largest vertebra, especially the body, because they hold more weight. Nice thick body. No costal facets because they do not articulate with the ribs. And then below that we get to this weird structure, the sacrum, and below that, inferior to that, the coccyx, or the tailbone. So the sacrum is formed by a fusion of 5 sacral vertebrae, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. In the adult, the articulations between them ossify over, the cartilage becomes solid bone. And that's completed by about age 25. And the sacral canal passageway here accommodates the spinal nerves that come down, and then the spinal nerves exit via the appropriate sacral foramina on the sacrum. And then there's something called the auricular surface on the sacrum here. This is a lateral view, posterior view, anterior view, and that auricular surface on each side, lateral side of the sacrum, articulates with your two hip bones, forming the sacroiliac joints. And then finally, at the inferior end of the vertebral column, the coccyx, also formed by the fusion of 3 to 5 coccygeal vertebra, and just like the sacrum, they fuse by about age 25. And you know where this is if you've ever fallen on your rear end and injured it or bruised it or possibly broken it. Okay, thoracic cage. The rib cage consists of the thoracic vertebra, T1 through T12, the 12 pairs of ribs, or costae, and then the sternum, your breastbone. Overall functions, protecting the organs in here, heart and lungs, involved with respiration. So down here inferiorly, in the inferior end, attachment for the diaphragm. Between the ribs, as we'll see later on, there's internal muscles, intercostal muscles that allow the, that allow the rib cage to expand. The ribs come up and then drop down when you breathe in and breathe out. And then the ribs attach posteriorly to the vertebral column, helping support that. And then also the sternum, in particular the manubrium, is the site of attachment for the clavicle, your collarbone, which articulates, attaches to your scapula, shoulder blade, and then that articulates with your upper arm bone, the humerus. So 3 regions on the sternum. The manubrium articulates with the clavicle there at the clavicular notch, and the first pair of ribs. Then as we move inferiorly, the larger body articulates with costal ribs 2 through 7 with their cartilages. And then finally at the inferior end, there's the xiphoid process, which attaches to the diaphragm and the rectus abdominal muscles you utilize to do sit-ups. And then up here at the superior end, there's that jugular notch that you can actually feel with your finger a little bit. Nice little groove. And moving finally to the ribs. So 12 pairs of long curved flat bones. The first 7 pair are called true ribs, or vertebral sternal, because they articulate with the vertebral column and also the sternum via cartilage. And then pairs 8 through 10 are called false ribs, vertebral chondral, because their cartilages fuse together to meet the sternum anteriorly. And then lastly, pairs 11 and 12 are called the floating ribs, because they have no attachment to the sternum. They attach posteriorly at the vertebral column, and then they are short. They do not go all the way forward anteriorly to meet the sternum. Okay. Let me show you that right over here. Boom. So notice pairs 1 through 7, they have their own independent cartilages here in brown that come forward and articulate with the sternum. But pairs 8, 9, and 10, their cartilages fuse together before that cartilage comes anterior to meet the sternum, so hence the false ribs. And then 11 and 12 are the floating ribs, which are also false ribs, but they're floating ribs because they do not articulate at all with the sternum. They have no cartilages that come forward. Okay, so let me see. I think that covers it. Yep, except for on the ribs posterior. This is kind of a posterior view. We have the head, which articulates with the costal facets on the vertebra, little thin neck, and that tubercle there articulates with the costal facets on the transverse process. And then that sharp angle is on the inferior border, and there's a costal groove, and then that arches forward. And on the sternal end of the rib, on these pairs 1 through 10, there's cartilage that will eventually come forward to meet the sternum. And that is it for our chapter 6.